question period. We're going to continue with our 10-minute question periods as with the other panel, and we'll start with Mr. Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Perlin and General Martinez-Lopez, you've heard Dr. Haley, Dr. Henderson, and Dr. Greengard give us some reasons for optimism. And yet, as I understand it, General, the DOD is putting zero money into Gulf War research this year. Can you explain to me, given the fact that we have seen some significant breakthroughs, why we would not be working with these researchers?
Sir, we're still pursuing this level of research. In other words, the research that is being done to my left by this distinguished scientist, this research has been funded and will continue to be funded by the Department of Defense. But, you know, the focus of the department has shifted to force health protection. And that may be where many of the issues of force health protection are exactly deals with issues that are very relevant to Gulf War illnesses. So one does not eliminate the need of the other.
Okay. Dr. Perlin, how is the VA responding to the research that we've heard?
Thank you, Mr. Sanders. You're absolutely correct. The research that's been presented, these hypotheses are very intriguing and deserve further study. It's really been in this past few months that we've forged a close working relationship with the Gulf War Research Advisory Committee, and for that we greatly appreciate Mr. Binn's leadership. These are exactly the sorts of things that we want to take to further study. For example, the research that Dr. Haley described will come to further evaluation at the new Neuroimaging Center in San Francisco. Dr. Michael Weiner runs that. This imaging center allows us not only to see the actual structure of the brain in individuals who may be experiencing or who are experiencing these sorts of symptoms, but because it's actually magnetic resonance spectroscopy actually allows us to look at the brain function. So in fact, in all of these sorts of avenues, they're really the basis for hypothesis-driven research that we can translate into a greater understanding.
Thank you. Dr. Haley, what excites me, and I think people who are struggling with Gulf War illness, is I understand it, what you are saying that through brain imagery, you could actually see the brain damage and make a correlation between that brain damage and the symptoms that the individual is suffering. Am I right in that?
Yeah, that's correct. Brain research, neuroscience has progressed dramatically in the last 10 years. If we had tried to address it with these techniques in 1992 or 1993, we wouldn't have had these techniques available by and large. And so there's a great panoply of techniques that are available, and there's an explosion going on right now. Every month we see new techniques. And so we now have the tools to do it, and so I think, and we have the clues, and now's the time to put money into this and study Gulf War veterans, as well as new issues, emerging issues of force health protection in the current operations. So now's the golden moment to fund research.
Okay, let me ask you a question, and a little bit outside of your general area of work. Many of us have been extremely dissatisfied with the lack of progress made by the DOD and VA over the years, and we've been impressed by your work and other people's work. Give us an idea of how funding could be most effective to those people who are doing the most serious research.
It's a tough question, and I think Jim Benz really summed it up perfectly, and Steve Robinson, and the combination of their comments. I think, for one thing, I think there's been a change in viewpoint in this whole field. We see the scientific community now starting to buy into the issue, to the idea that even low-level chemical exposures in susceptible individuals can produce brain cell injury. That's no longer makes you a pariah to say that. It used to, but it's now a popular concept. And so I think you're going to see naturally the government agencies wanting to fund that research because it's not so controversial. We were at a meeting at NIH just a month or so ago with DOD people, NIH people, private researchers there, and it was just a given that nerve gas can produce, low-level nerve gas can produce symptoms and chronic illness. And
because of brain damage?
Yes, because of physical brain cell damage, and there's now a new alliance forming between NINDS, National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Disorders and Stroke, and Defense Department, Fort Detrick, and the Institute for Chemical Defense to look at those issues. particularly as they relate to defense against chemical terrorism.
Let me ask you this.
That is unfunded yet, but it
All right,
needs
we're
to
all
be.
obviously concerned about the potentials of chemical terrorism, but we're also concerned about a number of civilian diseases. Are you learning anything in your research that could help us with chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, or multiple chemical sensitivity or other type diseases?
It remains to be seen because we haven't applied these techniques to those. We have plans actually to do that, and part of our funding, congressional funding through Fort Detrick, is to look and compare chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, multiple chemical sensitivity, and other similar illnesses with Gulf War illness. So we, and I'm sure others, will be doing that as well. In terms of, let me get back to the funding issue because that's what's critical. I think what you want to see is a mosaic of funding. You don't want all the funding to be in one place, and I think that was one of the places perhaps we went wrong before. The Persian Gulf Veterans Coordinating Board that sort of oversaw all the research in the government really had a strong agenda, and I think led all of that in a direction. I think what you want to see, you'd like to see NIH with this NINDS Defense Department collaboration. You'd like to see that go. We have a new collaboration funding research with NIH, VA, and the ALS Association funding research on ALS. You'd like to support that with government funding. You'd like also to have some funding specifically directed for Gulf War veterans to understand that particular group and have some good oversight by the VA Research Advisory Committee, as was suggested earlier. In collaboration with VA Research and Development, that is emerging as a good model.
Okay.
So I think all of these ought to be supported.
Let me ask Dr. Henderson and Dr. Greengard the same question. It appears that we may be making some significant breakthroughs, not only with understanding the symptoms of Gulf War illness, but perhaps other diseases and preparing us, God forbid, for many chemical terrorist attacks. What's your suggestion as to how we can move forward most effectively in better understanding these problems?
Well, I think you have your heavy science hitters, your heavy hitters in NIH, and you'd like to bring those heavy hitters in on this very, I'm sorry. Get closer. Okay. I think that it would be good to bring those heavy hitters in on this problem, but you also have to have the DOD working collaboratively with them. So I was at the same meeting that Dr. Haley attended where NIH was working with DOD together to see how can NIH contribute to this problem. I think that type of collaboration is essential. It can't just be one agency. It has to be, if it can be achieved, intergovernmental cooperation, interagency cooperation. So I would recommend that NIH and DOD work together on this.
Thank you. Dr. Greengard?
I would just as soon not get into the issues of which agencies. I get nervous just coming to Washington, let alone saying which agency should be the recipient of your beneficence. I've had very good experience with the Department of Defense in two ways. One, I have been doing some work for them in medical research in another area, not chemical warfare or Gulf War illness, and I gradually began to learn about the problems of the chemical warfare agents, and I was almost oblivious of it, as I think a large segment of the scientific population are. And much of the work that we have done in the past has been concerned with how nerve cells communicate with each other, what goes wrong in various neurological and psychiatric disorders, how drugs that affect these disorders, treat these disorders, achieve their actions, and using this information to try to develop better drugs. The situation with these cholinesterase inhibitors is quite analogous. I can take an example. For example, Parkinson's disease is associated with the loss of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And neurotransmitters are chemicals that communicate between nerve cells. You can think of victims of these chemical warfare agents as being people who have, it would be the same as if they've been congenitally consigned to a life with too much of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. These are very soluble problems. And just like it's been possible to make great progress in understanding Parkinson's disease and finding treatments for it, it's quite analogous with the chemical warfare agents. The technology is there now, the science the major principles of the science have been established. It's just a matter almost of engineering now to do this. The problem is that there's no money available. When I got interested in the chemical warfare problems, because they're so analogous to some of the things we've dealt with, I have talked to various people that I know in various branches of the government, and there's practically no money anyplace. This is true at sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me just go back and conclude, going back to General Martinez-Lopez and Dr. Perlin. Do both of you now accept the premise that one of the possible causes of Gulf War illness is brain damage associated to low-level exposure to sarin and perhaps other agents?
I think there's enough science there, sir, to take that as a very serious consideration. In other words, I think, yes, there may be some soldiers from the Gulf War that were affected because of low exposure to sarin.
Okay, Dr. Perlin?
Given the research contributed by people such as Dr. Greengard, I think it is quite plausible, quite believable that there is damage from low-level exposure to nerve agents, and that can be a basis of, in fact, multiple diseases and nerve dysfunction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sanders.
Should I continue, sir? Or?
I'm sorry? Yes?
Yes. We have gotten support from the Department of Defense, both in terms of a certain amount of funding for chemical warfare research, but it's been very small because they had very small pot to give money out of. And also, we have collaborated with the Institute for Chemical Defense, where we've done experiments with people there with sarin and have shown chemical changes in the brain in the same regions that Dr. Haley and Dr. Henderson talked about. Now, here's three entirely different approaches all coming to the same conclusion, that these chemical warfare agents are causing disruptions in the region of the brain called the basal ganglia, and that happens to be a region we know an enormous amount about.
You did this on, these are animal studies?
Yes, sir.
What, rats is? What
Yes. They were done in collaboration with this Institute for Chemical Defense because you can't get sarin very easily.
So you have more or less replicated in rats what Dr. Haley has seen in Gulf War veterans?
We have replicated in rats that there is damage in this same region of the brain. The measurements are somewhat different, but a simple answer to your question would be yes, with some small caveats.
Okay, and what you're saying basically is more money is needed to continue this research?
Yes, I mean, just what Mr. Bin said, like bioterrorism, $1.7 billion to NIH, radiation, 44 million, chemical, 0. So I've been going around and everybody says, yeah, this is really needed and what your ideas are very, very good, let's do it. We don't have any money. Okay. Call me again next year.
Okay.
When I hear again, I'll get an even worse answer next year.
Thanks very much for your comments. Thank you. Oops. Mr. Chairman,
go ahead. This is
I would just like to point out one thing that may seem obvious to everyone, and who should fund this? And the reason I said you have to have collaboration with DOD is they have the sarin. I mean, for our work, we thought about, well, we'll go to NIH for funding, and you want the sarin to be under good control. And so I'm glad the DOD has it, and that's something to consider, that they have to be involved.
Okay, thank you.
General, I have a question